Hello, this is Themantic Education's TOK Exhibition Sample 1. Hopefully it's just the first video in a whole series of videos that we're planning. Here's a quick overview of what I'm going to do here. Essentially, I will try to create a TOK exhibition from scratch and demonstrate my whole thinking process behind it. I will try to think about how it will be marked, what I have created, and I will invite you to mark the exhibition together with me. As a quick reminder, you know that requirements for the TOK exhibition is that you must select 3 real-world objects. You must link them to one of the 35 knowledge questions that are given in the IB TOK guide. Create a written commentary of up to 950 words for all 3 objects combined. And for each of the objects in the commentary, you must include the following 3 things. Identify the object and its specific real-world context, explain the link to the IA prompt, and justify the inclusion of the object in your exhibition. These requirements are unpacked slightly further in our recent video entitled What is the TOK Exhibition? It's available on our YouTube channel. Please do check it out. The IB TOK guide describes the requirements to the final product, the IB exhibition task. But of course, the problem is that we can clearly understand the requirements, but the challenge is how to get there. So I'm here now, and I should get there over the course of time. And you have described what my final product should look like. But where do I even start? How do I select my objects? And what exactly do I write in my commentary to get the marks, and what exactly should I write for the examiner to say that I have justified the inclusion of my object in the exhibition successfully? I feel like the only reasonable way to start answering these questions is to demonstrate the TOK exhibition in the process of creation rather than the final product, and that's exactly what I will try to do in this video. So I will invite you to think together with me and to sequentially create a sample TOK exhibition, starting with one object and then thinking about how I can add further objects to that. I realize that there are many different approaches that students can take when creating their TOK exhibition, so I will take one of the possible approaches in this video, and hopefully when I make other videos, I will take slightly different approaches and demonstrate a whole variety of them. So let's go over to some starting point. So obviously the most daunting task is probably to start choosing some objects for your TOK exhibition. You have a lot to choose from. The world is a really big place, and which objects do you choose? The list of IA prompts in the guide is also quite extensive. It's 35 knowledge questions, and the knowledge questions themselves are so generic that, well, they embrace practically everything in the whole wide world. So what do? Well, I have 2 quick pieces of advice to you before you start. The first piece of advice is to focus on selecting one object at first, rather than 3 objects, and don't worry about the other 2. The reason I'm saying so is because the choice of the other 2 objects will, at the end of the day, depend on what your first object is and how you have explained its connection to the prompt. As you know, you will have to justify the inclusion of each of your objects in the exhibition, and to a large extent, how you justify the inclusion of the second object depends on how you have connected the first object to your IA prompt. So focus on selecting one object first, and that seems like a more manageable task, and don't worry too much about the other 2 objects for the time being. That's exactly the approach I'm going to take in this particular video. And secondly, remember that this should be an object coming from a specific real-world context. The IB seems really adamant about that. So a generic teddy bear is not okay, but a teddy bear that you had as a child, and the teddy bear that you grew emotionally attached to, that's a lot better. So let's go over to selecting the first object for my TOK exhibition. I choose to start with the prompt for this particular video. I'm looking at at the list of 35 IA prompts in the IBTOK guide, and one of them catches my eye. It says, "Is bias inevitable in the production of knowledge?" And I just decide that I'm going to do an exhibition linking it to this particular prompt, and I will not look at other prompts for the time being. That's my way to narrow down my choice now. I'm starting with the knowledge question. So now I have a knowledge question, so what do I do next? I look at it again. It says, "Is bias inevitable in the production of knowledge?" And I just rack my brain. So what do I have to say about that? Bias in the production of knowledge. And when I think about that, the first thing that comes to my mind somehow is the idea of scientific measurement. I know that scientists carry out measurements, and usually scientific measurements are associated with the concept of precision. There's no bias involved. It's precise, accurate measurements. And then I suddenly remember something I read about recently. This thingy called the big K. K stands for the kilogram. I really used my background knowledge because I read something recently and it just popped up in my head. The thing I read recently, by the way, was this brand new, awesome TOK textbook for the new syllabus from Themantic Education. On page 460 there's a discussion of the big K and where it comes from. Essentially, what you need to know is how do we measure something in science? How do we measure a kilogram, for example? Until very recently, there was no other way but to take an arbitrary object like this one and to just agree that a kilogram is a mass of any object that is equivalent to the mass of this arbitrary object that we have taken. And that's exactly what has been done. In 1889, scientists gathered together. They took a boulder, well, not really a boulder, it was an alloy of platinum and aluminium, of platinum and iridium. And they just decided that the weight, the mass of this object will be what we call 1 kilogram. It has been housed ever since at the International Bureau of Weights and Measures in France. And we just agreed that a kilogram is the mass equivalent to the mass of this object. But the problem is, although obviously we tried to keep it intact as much as we could in almost absolutely perfect vacuum under these spheres, as you can see in the picture, we couldn't preserve its weight. And it is true that since 1889 it has become a little bit lighter. So it lost approximately 50 micrograms of weight, which is the weight of an eyelash. So the big K has become lighter over the course of time. And this may mean that our measurements of weight today is systematically biased in relation to what we agreed to consider 1 kilogram 130 years ago. So if we say that 1 kilogram is something that is equivalent to that thing, but the weighting instrument that I'm using was calibrated long ago, and now I'm using it again and it shows 1 kilogram. But the prototype has changed in this course of time. So will it mean that in all my measurements, I will overestimate the weight of the object that I'm measuring, which kind of seems to link to the idea of bias. So decided then, for my first object, I will just use the big K because it popped up so conveniently in my head. So the real-world context will be what I have just described. It's a prototype, and we decided to use it as a prototype for 1 kilogram in 1889, and its mass has changed a little. That's its real-world context. How will I explain the link to the IA prompt? Well, I can say that in science, measurements are done against a certain standard or a prototype. But standards themselves may change naturally due to laws of nature that we have no control over. And when they do change, our new measurements become biased in a certain sense. And how do I justify the inclusion of the exhibition in my object? Well, I can say that this did just say inclusion of exhibition in my object, obviously meant inclusion of objects in my exhibition. I can say that it illustrates that even scientific measurements may be biased for reasons that we cannot control. That last part here is really important. So bias is inevitable because the big K will change its mass whatever I try to do to prevent that from happening. Okay, now that I have decided on my first object, it seems fine. So how do I select the second object now? I tried to make something else pop up in my head as conveniently as the big K did, but I seem to be lacking knowledge in this area. Just nothing comes to my mind, and I feel stuck, I feel puzzled. So I started just thinking and wondering to myself, are there any other fields where we can say with certainty that there is no bias? When I tried to remember the prompt, which said, is bias inevitable in the production of knowledge? My starting point was kind of to challenge this question and to try to think of things where bias is not inevitable, and I thought about science, but then the big K came to my mind, and that seems to suggest that bias in science is not as inevitable as we might think. So can I just continue thinking further and find some other examples where bias is not inevitable, where it's possible to avoid bias? And when I keep thinking about that, mathematical calculations come to mind, really. When I'm using a calculator, for example, I put my trust in it. I seem to trust that my calculator produces a reliable result. And there seems to be no reason to not trust it. And mathematics in general is an area of knowledge that is associated with absolute knowledge and absolute precision. A mathematician may be wrong or biased, or make a mistake. But then another mathematician will cross-check the calculations and correct the mistakes. So mathematicians can be biased, but it seems like mathematics itself cannot be biased. And when I keep thinking about it, I keep thinking about which objects can possibly represent this kind of idea that mathematical reasoning seems beyond bias. It's something where bias is not inevitable. A calculator comes to my mind, obviously. So a question pops up in my head: can calculators ever be wrong? I just wonder, and I really don't know. So they seem to be associated with absolute precision in my mind, but is that so? And I was never interested in that, actually. I have no idea. I presume that they can never be wrong, but can be any different. So because I lack background knowledge here, I start searching it online. So I went online and I Googled, can a calculator be wrong? And these are the results that came out. So the very first link there, if you go to videos, takes me to this interesting video. Among other things, I found it, and it explains that there's a particular brand of a calculator, Casio FX83 GT+, which seems to be susceptible to this particular type of mistake. If you input 11 to the power of 6 divided by 13 into that particular calculator, but not into any other calculator, it gives you the response that you can see on the screen now. It's a fraction of whole numbers multiplied by pi. But the thing is, this response is obviously wrong, because pi, by definition, is an irrational number, which means that it cannot be represented as a fraction or as a multiple of a fraction. That's obviously incorrect, and that contradicts the nature of mathematics. So it's a wrong response. And yet this particular calculator gives a wrong response to this particular problem, but not any other problem. Note here that before I started my research, I didn't even suspect that this calculator exists and that it makes this kind of a mistake. I used Google to find it. So to identify my second object, I didn't use my background knowledge anymore. I used some random internet research that was driven by the curious questions that I was asking myself. So there you go. I will decide to include this particular calculator into my exhibition as the second object. The reason that this mistake is being made, by the way, is that pi is infinite. Again, by definition, there's an infinite number of digits after the decimal point. But the calculator's memory, by definition, cannot be infinite, because power of our technology cannot be as infinite as mathematics is. Therefore, at some point, there has to be some truncation happening, and the calculator has to use some approximation somewhere on some level. Interestingly enough, with other examples, it doesn't work, and it's only 11, only to the power of 6, and only divided by 13, and only on this particular calculator that produces the mistake. We don't know why, and we don't know how to explain that. So I'm including this calculator as the second object in my exhibition. The real-world context seems to be pretty specific. How will I explain the link to the IA prompt? Well, this example shows that there is, even in something as certain as mathematics, there could be mistakes. It's not mathematics itself that is mistaken, but technology that we use to do the mathematics. And to justify the inclusion of my object in my exhibition, I can bring up the idea of inevitability again. My prompt said that bias in the production of knowledge is inevitable. So here we can see that it seems to be an inevitable problem that imperfect technology will always have to use some sort of an approximation to deal with perfect mathematics. Although mathematical entities are infinite, the power of our technology cannot be equally infinite, and therefore it's unavoidable that on some level some mistakes will be made. Let's look at the third object then. Again, I'm kind of puzzled and I don't know where to look for it, and I let my mind wander again, and I think back to what already happened. I already said that natural fluctuations due to laws of nature may be an unavoidable source of bias. I already looked at the role of imperfect technology, which also create an unavoidable source of bias of sorts. And I can't really think of anything else, so I've looked at such areas that are commonly associated with the lack of bias: scientific measurements and mathematical calculations. If not these two things, then nothing is really less biased than these two things. At least that's my intuitive thinking for now. And I feel a bit stuck, and I feel a bit puzzled. I don't know where to go from here. But I continue just contemplating this thing, and I continue letting my mind wander. And I realize that I've been talking about scientific measurements and technology and mathematics, and it makes me want to consider something else, maybe from some other walk of life. Somehow I start just savoring the words of the IA prompt: bias. What other kinds of bias do I know? What comes to mind are things like racial bias or gender bias. These are also kinds of bias. Are they inevitable, I ask myself, and how do people even become biased in those particular ways? Are there ways in which we can realize and become aware of our own biases? I start thinking about my own childhood. Was I exposed to things that made me biased? Am I racially biased right now? If I am, how do I understand that? And if I am, where did it come from? Was my childhood responsible? What exactly in my childhood was responsible for my racial bias? Well, in my childhood, I was exposed to lots of literature, for example, fairy tales, and somehow my mind wanders in that area, and I start thinking about fairy tales. Are they biased against, are they racially biased? Are they gender biased? And again, I don't know. I never really wondered about that. So maybe that's another kind of those situations when it's time to Google stuff. So I Googled, can fairy tales be racially biased? I did a little research on the internet, and apparently I found out that it's a huge thing. I found an article, for example, that argues that fairy tales are inherently biased and they portray gender differences in a stereotypical, rigid way. One author, for example, expressed concerns that in The Sleeping Beauty, there's a man who kisses a sleeping woman without her consent, and that man is presented as a hero, which is a problematic situation from our contemporary perspective. And I never thought about it this way. For me, The Sleeping Beauty was an innocent fairy tale. But the article claims that some parents have made the choice to not expose their children to tales like The Sleeping Beauty, and they opted out consciously of a bunch of fairy tales. And these biases, once you think about them, the interesting thing about them is that they're not immediately obvious. They're so deeply woven into our culture. I listened to all those fairy tales when I was a child, but I never thought about The Sleeping Beauty that way. So I'm thinking that will be my third object. One of the articles that I read, Brendan Cole's article, the title of which you can see on the screen now, can be my third object. And my specific real-world context could be that, well, after reading this article, I suddenly realized that stuff I was exposed to in my childhood might have been biased in all sorts of nasty ways without my awareness. It seems like a pretty specific personal context behind this particular article. So how am I going to explain the link of this object to the IA prompt? I can say that there are biases that are hardwired into our culture and they get transmitted through such things as fairy tales. And when you're little, it's pretty difficult to analyze information critically, so you just absorb whatever you're given together with the biases, which makes it inevitable that you will become biased if you grow up in that kind of culture. And how am I going to justify the inclusion of the object in my exhibition? Well, again, looking back at my first two objects, my first object sent the message that bias may be created by the changing reality of things, like the natural fluctuations, not fluctuation, the naturally reducing weight of the big K. My second object seems to have sent the message that bias may be a result of imperfect technology. And while my third object seems to be sending the message that bias may be a result of cultural transmission at a very young age. So it all comes together now, and it seems like my three objects highlight three different ways in which bias is inevitable in the production of knowledge. They all demonstrate different dimensions, different aspects of this inevitability, if you will. So looking back at the three objects, here they are, and this is going to become my TOK exhibition. One of the objects is digital, but as you know, it is allowed. And just to make a comment about the thinking process that went into the selection of these three objects, I call it the top-down thinking process because I started with the knowledge question and worked my way down to the objects. I selected the IA prompt that seemed attractive to me at first, and then I kind of thought about it on an abstract level, and then I tried to find objects that represent or illustrate that knowledge question. Note that some of the objects came from my previous experience, like the big K. I read about it in an awesome book, and some other objects, like the other two, came from extra research that I did on the internet. Before I started working on my TOK exhibition, I didn't suspect that these two other objects existed, but guided by my thinking process, by my theoretical exploration of the prompt, I was able to Google some pretty specific questions like can calculators be wrong? And that led me to identify the other objects that I want to use to include in my exhibition. I will try other kinds of approaches in my other exhibition samples as well, including the bottom-up approach, where you start with the object and then you try to find the knowledge question that is most suitable to it. Let's now look at this exhibition from the marking perspective. Obviously, I was trying to do a decent job, and I think I did a decent job, but also I want to know if there is anything that can potentially be identified as a weakness by an examiner. Some points of potential weaknesses that come to my mind are, could it be that my objects are not original enough? Can they say that my objects are not linked well enough to the prompt? Can they say that the inclusion of my objects in the exhibition is not justified well enough? And can they say that my exhibition is not based on one of the themes, and can that potentially create a problem? Note that I'm not asking if they can say that my real-world context is not specific enough, because I do think that for all the three objects in this exhibition, it's a specific enough real-world context. In terms of originality, could it be that my objects are not original enough? Well, my thinking is there's nothing in the criteria that says they should be original and non-trivial. As far as I'm concerned, they can be quite mundane, everyday objects. What is being assessed in the TOK exhibition task is not the objects themselves, but the way the objects are linked to the knowledge question, to the IA prompt. Yeah, so I think originality is not a problem. Can they say that my objects are not linked well enough to the prompt? Well, looking back, again, it's not the object itself that matters here, but the explanation about this link. And I have explained that, for example, I linked my calculator to the prompt by explaining that due to inevitable imperfections of technology, we can't really achieve infinite accuracy of calculations, and that will inevitably produce some approximations and mistakes on some level. So I think I have managed to capture the idea of inevitability in all the three objects of mine. So uh, that idea is conveyed pretty accurately. Uh, what else could possibly go wrong? Maybe examiners will say that I haven't captured the idea of bias well enough. Bias, as you know, is not the same as random error. It's not the same as mistake. And maybe the mistake that is produced by a calculator, it cannot be categorized as a bias, really. And even what I discussed with the big K, maybe examiners may say that um, that's not precisely about bias, or that's not about bias precisely enough. When I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking, well, will this really be a problem? Will examiners go that deeply into how accurately the nature of concepts has been captured by the objects? And I think not. I think examiners will not dig as deep as that. As long as some idea of bias or some idea of what the student understands as a kind of bias is conveyed through the exhibition, I think examiners will be pretty much satisfied, but do tell me if you think otherwise. About justifying the inclusion, can they say that the inclusion of my objects in the exhibition is not justified well enough? Well, the approach I have taken to justifying the inclusion of the object is to explain what unique contribution each of the objects makes. For example, my big K example demonstrates that some bias in measurement is inevitable because the baseline, the prototype, is changeable due to laws of nature that we have no control over. My calculator demonstrates that some bias is inevitable due to imperfection of technology, and that's also inevitable. And my Sleeping Beauty example demonstrates that some biases are inevitable because they're hardwired into our culture, and when we internalize them, we're too young and innocent to become aware of this and to resist this process. So the three objects highlight three different reasons why bias in the production of knowledge is inevitable. And that, for me, is a justification for the inclusion of the objects in the exhibition. And finally, the themes. Can they say that my exhibition is not based on one of the themes, and can it potentially create a problem in terms of marking? As you know, the IB strongly recommends that the exhibition is based on one of the themes. And as you could have noticed, when I was creating this exhibition sample, I was not in fact bothered about themes when I was selecting my objects. I was looking at the knowledge question. I was working my way down from there, and I was looking for objects in the entire wide world that could be used to illustrate the idea of inevitability of bias in the production of knowledge. In fact, limiting myself to one of the themes seemed like a limitation factor to me. I think that there are two key things to remember here. One is, although the IB makes this strong recommendation, there is no requirement to actually explicitly explain the link to one of the themes in the commentary. I would actually advise against it, because if you explain the link to the theme, you may end up wasting the word count that may be quite valuable elsewhere. It is not one of the formally assessed requirements, the explanation of the link between the objects and the themes. And secondly, I think it's important to remember that, as it is stated in the IB-TOK guide, the reason this strong recommendation is there is to narrow down the choice of objects for the students and make the task less overwhelming and less daunting for them, so that they don't choose from the entire wild world, but they choose from a more well-defined range of topics that they have already studied. I'm thankful that I don't have to explicitly explain the links between my objects and the theme in the commentary, but I also want to know if that could potentially be a problem. I realize that if anyone asks, even my three objects, although I was not thinking about how they could be connected to a theme, they actually can be connected to a theme pretty obviously. The calculator obviously falls under knowledge and technology. Sleeping Beauty may fall under knowledge and language, and the kilogram may fall under either knowledge and technology too, or maybe knowledge and the knower, which is the most generic theme out there. What I'm trying to say is that although I wasn't explicitly thinking about linking my object to one of the themes. At the end of the day, a lot of objects will have some connection to the themes because the themes are so broad in their nature. I do think this lack of explicit connections to the themes in my exhibition will not create a problem in terms of marking, and it will not prevent me from getting top marks, but do tell me if you feel otherwise. And finally, I invite you once again to give this exhibition a mark and to justify it. I'm interested in your opinions because we're all currently in the same boat. We're trying to decipher the IB assessment criteria, operationalize them, and understand what exactly it is that the IB wants from us. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.